Every third party is also a first party is kind of how I think about it. It's funny, I was talking to different customers and all that, and they're worried about nth party nowadays. There's a lot of ways to think about this, and a lot of us think about the cybersecurity, or at least digital supply chain, right? When you start to get into a little bit less connected or digital organizations, you think about things like their supply chain could be, sugarcane that's coming in from places, and that relies on transportation. And so there is a business function to it, not just a cyber function.
Welcome to State of Security Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Hancock. Today, we're going to be talking about securing your supply chain. As you've noticed in the last 12 months, there's been a lot of breaches, over a dozen. I've got a few here that I've outlined. AT&T, MoveIt, Ticketmaster, Dell, Bank of America, the list goes on. Just in this year of the number of cybersecurity breaches that have been related or tagged or tied to or utilizing an organization's supply chain. It's a key topic. It's a hot topic. It does touch on some elements of what a company can control, but mostly elements of security operations that a company cannot control, meaning their supply chain and their downstream, and they're in somebody's supply chain, they're upstream. So it does represent a continuous risk to organizations. Today, we're going to talk about that, ideally with some suggestions, recommendations for the listeners, for you guys, for people to understand what you should consider, what you should think about when you want to start securing your supply chain, whether it's a program or a product or technology. With us today, we've got Chris Poulin and Mike Caruso. Chris comes from us from BitSite, and Mike is a returning guest for our podcast today. So, Chris, Mike, you guys want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Jump in. And so Chris Poulin, I am from BitSite. As you said, I am the field CISO, which is just a fancy title, which means that I get to talk to our customers and I work with our product management and our data science and engineering teams and make sure that we have, that we provide to customers what they're looking for and that we get feedback from those customers. I've been at BitSite for 6 years, but I've been in cyber for 40 years. Believe it or not. I can't believe it, to be honest with you. Starting out in the military, I worked in the intelligence community as Air Force and leveraged that and popped out into the private sector and started my own consultancy. And I've been CISO at QN Labs. I spent some time at IBM. I ran the IoT security practice for oil and gas and connected car for Booz Allen for a time. And then I found myself here at BitSite. So been around the block a little bit. Have seen a lot, and hopefully I can bring some experience to this podcast. Looking forward to this conversation.
Very cool. Thank you very much.
Yes, I'm Mike Caruso. I'm the Director of Third-Party Risk Management here at Access Point. Formerly a CISO, I've also run computer operations, network, and security teams.
You know, as we've talked about before in our prep call and just in the side conversations that we've had, right, there's still a big gap. As a CISO, when you look at your security and your supply chain for your organization, it is something that you have to depend on others for, that you cannot touch. You don't have direct control in some cases. You can require organizations to have certain standards, security standards, but you're also in the supply chain of someone else. And I think that gets lost on the conversation quite a bit. We always think downstream, who's helping us? They need to be secure before they talk to us, but are we secure before we talk to our supply chain upstream? And that adds the complexity as a CISO, right? Being a CISO before, supply chain was always an ongoing program. It never ended. It was always something there. So today, as we discuss this, how would you guys define that, right? When you look at supply chain security, what elements go into that? Let's start there from a basic level.
Yeah, I'll jump in real quick. So it's interesting because I like your point, by the way, is that every third party is also a first party is kind of how I think about it.
Yeah.
And it's funny, I was talking to different customers and all that, and they're worried about nth party nowadays, right? So fourth party, fifth party.
Yeah.
I think it's a Kevin Bacon problem. Eventually you end up looping back on yourself, right? Nobody's more than 6 degrees away from anybody else when it comes to supply chain, I think, at some point. But I mean, all joking aside, the reality is that there's a lot of ways to think about this. And a lot of us think about the cybersecurity, or at least digital supply chain, right? And you mentioned MoveIt and things like that. But there's also, when you start to get into a little bit less connected or digital organizations, you think about things like even like I worked with a big food processing plant that their supply chain could be, sugarcane that's coming in from places, and that relies on transportation. And so there is a business function to it, not just a cyber function. So business continuity. So there's a lot of piece and parts, like, for example, automotive. Auto manufacturers don't make cars anymore. They assemble them from everybody else. They buy things from Bosch and Continental, and there's even seat providers who have like specialized seats. And so even if you think about a car, there's a couple things, right? You have a supply chain problem, so business continuity. You can't make cars if you don't get the seats because they've had a cyber problem downstream. So that would be your fourth party, right? Because they're relying on some somebody who's connected to do something, and they don't get their parts. But there's also a direct problem because let's say you get a part from Bosch or Continental, and I'm not suggesting either one of those has anything less than a stellar program, but just an example, if that's a brake component, right, an electronic control unit for a brake, and the firmware has been tampered with at the manufacturing plant where they're actually built and the firmware was put in them, or in transit, somebody got access to the supply chain when it was sitting in a warehouse ready to get loaded onto a ship, that's a problem as well, right? So, but I think most people think about it in terms of, we used to have a perimeter and we secured our perimeter and everybody was happy. But now our perimeter is the entire world, right? If you point me to an organization that doesn't have at least a dozen third parties they rely on for critical assets and storing data, I'll go work for that company because that's an easy CISO job right there.
Right.
Yeah, for
Exactly.
sure.
Exactly. Mike?
Yeah, I mean, it's just like you said. I mean, everyone's reliant on multiple third parties, and they all bring a different risk. And the hard part is finding out you know what's the risk, and how do you verify that they're not vulnerable. They might have controls in place that could have all the documents, but is it configured correctly? Is somebody watching the logs if you're feeding logs? I mean, so I think you hit the point, Chris, on incident response. I think that's key, that they've got to really have a good business continuity and incident response plan. And that's something I think, I don't know if everyone really checks that. You might check the box and say, do you have one? But on a critical vendor, I think you really have to be involved in the testing and see the results.
It's interesting. I've seen more and more lately because I've been in a number of different jobs, right? I've been in security operations, I've run security operations, been in research, et cetera. But what I see that's sort of interesting is that as we go on, I mean, look, I'm an old guy. I remember working with DOS 3.1, right? Or Windows 3.1 way back in the day, where you had to know a lot more in order to get things to work properly. And now things just work out of the box, right? So, and I think sometimes that engenders a culture of set and forget, right? And I've talked to a lot of organizations. They say we have controls in place, and I'm like, well, how do you test those controls? So the fact that a control is in place does not mean that it's efficient. And to your point, Mike, it's not just configuration, although that is certainly part of it. But just because a vendor says this will solve your problem doesn't mean that control is going to solve your problem. You still need to go check it out. So I think that's a problem with the way that we actually look at third party now too, right? We send assessments and questionnaires and we say, what do you have in place? Send us your security policy. Let's see your artifacts, things like that. And they may all have the pieces in place, but you can have a bag full of Legos and not put them together and look like a good Death Star, right? So, it's about what you do with those pieces to make them work properly.
I agree. I think both of you hitting on a couple of points. So when you think about engaging your supply chain, you need to make sure that you have potentially an incident response plan that's unique to that supply chain or that particular vendor, because what they do may touch things differently that your other vendors don't touch. It might look differently than your current incident response plan for your organization. So there's some variability there. I've run into that firsthand as a CISO on multiple occasions, and getting my hand slapped, realizing, our corporate plan is great, but this throws a wrench into my monkey, so to speak, right? What am I going to do now, right? So I got to figure out how that's going to play out. And that's, again, not a lot of people think about that. Not CISOs aren't, to your point, culturally. And I remember, like, you can go buy a Cisco server or a piece of hardware, and it's pre-configured. You plug it into a data center and off you go. The problem is those configurations are also publicized on the internet. So it makes it really simple to be able to go in and hack a server that's sitting there or a device that's sitting there on the medical devices, manufacturing devices. They have these in place because it's plug and play and we get it. Well, bad guys can reverse engineer that all day long and be able to get their way in. So as a CISO, wait, there's always those extra steps you've got to make extra sure. And to both of your points, we call it the operationalization of your compliance standards. Right? It's great you can check the box in self-attestation, but when was the last time you did a tabletop? When was the last time you had an operational assessment? When was the last time you had a breach? How'd you handle it? It gets into conversations that not a lot of people want to have, especially if they're a new vendor, or they're an old vendor and you know they've been breached and they don't want to talk about it. Right? So it puts the CISO in a difficult situation for sure. When in the example you're giving earlier about automotive, my mind went to Airbus, right? They're manufacturers, from 7 different countries producing parts and pieces for their airplanes, and they're being assembled in Paris, somewhere in Paris. I'm like, that's crazy to me. I mean, that's my Lego piece over here is not going to fit with your Lego piece over here because we speak 2 different languages and we use metric and not use metric, and I mean, it's crazy. But that's a bigger example that we all have to live with to some degree. Bring that back down to what we're doing today, or what CISOs are dealing with today. I mean, what is and I think I like one of your comments here, your infrastructure and what it includes, Chris, and the consequences and access to your customer, the data. Some of the comments you made, I think were well said here. Can you expound on some of that?
Yeah. So I think my point here is a little bit what I was talking about before, right? Is that things extend beyond where your vendor ecosystem, your infrastructure extends to your vendor ecosystem, right? And you have to ask yourself what you're doing with those vendors, right? I think it's interesting because you can have a relationship with a single vendor, but have multiple contracts where you're doing different things, right? So let's say it's vendor ABC, and what you're doing is maybe they're you're a financial institution and they're a back-end processor, right? They do whatever. And so you're sending them data that A, is fundamental to your business, and B, is private, personally identifiable information, and also fungible assets might be at risk here too, because you're a financial institution. So there's a significant amount of risk by doing that, but you also might have that same organization, and maybe this is not the best example because I can't think of a financial organization. Well, maybe it is. They might also have access to your internal systems, right? They might be doing some sort of management, coding, I don't know, configuration, whatever it is. So, for example, I've worked with in a previous life, I worked with a lot of credit unions. And they are bare bones. They do not have a lot of free capital, right? So they do rely on third parties significantly. And it was interesting because I was talking to a couple of them on different engagements, and they both use the same backend processor. And that processor, because they know that the credit unions don't have a lot of technical expertise, encourage those credit unions to not put ACLs or any sort of firewalling between themselves and the backend process.
Nice.
Plus, the developers are writing apps that need 7,000 ports. Who knows, right? It's a go rodeo, basically. And I was thinking about the consequences. You've got credit union A, you have the processor who's this sort of central hub. Then you got credit union B through Z, and they all have access to each other transitively through this organization. And so your infrastructure is not just where you stop, even if you think it's not an internet connected organization, like if you're not using Azure or GCP or whatever, right? You still have something on the back end that causes the consequences are not just you're using processor A who has access to your data. You're now part of a bigger infrastructure that includes just about everybody in the credit union ecosystem. So,
and if I'm a bad guy, where am I going to go first?
Oh yeah, 100%.
Right.
risk concentration. That is the name of the game. And it's sorry to take up all the air here, but when I was at the X Force, we did a lot of dark web types of monitoring, right? And the thing that I walked away that sort of surprised me, and now I'm older and wiser as a consequence of it, is that the bad guys are not doing all that much that's innovative. They run like businesses. They're like, where's the money? And it colored my view of when I'm talking. You talked about Airbus. I think about it from cars or oil and gas because I spent a lot of time in those industries. Um, they're not going to, should you buy a Tesla? What if a bad guy hacks into it and, grabs the steering wheel and drives me off a tall bridge? Why? Why would they do that? That's
Right.
not to their best interest. Number one, that's crossing a ethical and probably a legal line, right, where they can prosecute it for murder, which you never want to, you never want to get there. But it's a hard thing to do. Why? I mean, as long as you can hack your grandmother's credit union just by sending them a phishing or a smishing text message, then do that, right? So that's why I don't worry about it. We're not at that point where it's clear. So the expression, right? And this is a little bit of a twist on it. You don't have to swim faster than the shark. You just have to swim faster than your dive buddy.
Right. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, for sure.
kind of applies here in that sense.
Yeah, popular term in special operations, let me tell you. So
There you
definitely that.
Mike, I've been taking up a lot of air. What do you have to say on the subject? Sorry about that.
I mean, you're right. I mean, it's the low hanging fruit. I mean, where can you get the most bang for your buck? But so I guess, you know, we don't have to worry about, like you said, the AI automation, where they're hacking into there, or what do you think in terms of that? Any benefit there, or
You mean should we be worried about places like OpenAI and Microsoft Copilot and stuff like that being a central
being a
target?
central spot where you're getting misinformation fed from a threat actor?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I know the threat actors are using AI to craft more convincing phishing, smishing, splat-ishing.
Yeah,
Um,
we're seeing that for sure.
but it's interesting though because there's two. This is like cloud. This reminds me so much of when cloud came around in 2010 or 2011 when it was really everybody was like, "What's the risk?" And I remember reporters reaching out all the time. I was at Q1 Labs at the time and saying, "What do you think about this? What does security mean from a cloud perspective?" And I didn't have an answer because I didn't understand what it meant, right? Nobody understood what the cloud really meant except the people who are building cloud. And of course, they're not going to talk because A, it's secret sauce. B, if they tell you what they're doing, then you know what their soft underbelly looks like. So, but now we have a really good idea. But what we've come to realize is that we have very little control over a cloud. And so all you can really do is trust that they have isolation between tenants, that they've got strong controls in place. And you can send things like the CAIQ cake questionnaire. You can have people fill it out if they're cloud based. But at the end of the day, you're still trusting quite a bit in what they're doing. And I think that's what's going to happen with AI eventually. When I worked at IBM, we did a lot with Watson. So I've, to a lot of, sorry, I'm starting three sentences and not finishing any of them right there. But Arthur C. Clarke, in his three rules, one of them was any sufficiently sophisticated technology is indistinguishable from magic, I think is what he said, right? I think a lot of people still think of AI as being magic at the moment, but the reality is it's a large language model, which means it understands language because it has to. That's how humans communicate with it, whether we do it verbally or through typing or whether it's reading documents off the internet or whatever it's doing. And then it's got basically statistical analysis in the back end. I mean, that's effectively what machine learning is, right? So it's not that magic. And so I think about it as cloud hosted app. So it's kind of a SaaS app at its core. The problem is that people, and I think that places like Anthropic and OpenAI are doing what they can to protect it because they have a stake in it. If somebody breaks into it, they lose business. So it's to their best interest. They are a digital business, period. So not that I trust them, I certainly would ask them what they're doing, but they're probably doing a good job. The problem then becomes how do you use it? And are they providing sufficient isolation on the back end? Because if you're an enterprise tenant of OpenAI, their contract says they're going to keep your prompts separate from company B's, right? So we don't know if they're doing that. They could be using it to train. Not I don't think they're doing it maliciously or intentionally, but it might bleed over. I just don't know. But I think the bigger issue is that we're still acclimating to it and we don't know how to use it. So we've seen the headlines where lawyers are asking it to write
Briefs. Yeah.
Hmm.
and it's hallucinating and then that gets found out. I mean, those are the things that worry me most because people lie, and that's the basis for politics, right? That is what politics is. And AI at the moment doesn't lie on purpose, but it may at some point, right? But it's hallucinating. And then, so basically, you've got a machine that you have to play politics with. You cannot trust what it says. It's something they call human in the loop, right? So you got to be part of it. You can't just let it run autonomously. A lot of people are.
And I think that's a particular challenge, right? When we look at the securing the supply chains, right? A lot of organizations are seeing, like Mike, I think to your point, right? How are they using AI, machine learning, to be able to expedite what they're doing from a business standpoint? What risk does that put us at as a corporation? What if my organization is using AI to some degree? What risk am I putting my customers at? My people who are my supply chain. Right? And I don't think people are thinking enough of that and that risk.
People are rushing to use AI because if you're not using AI, you're not relevant, right?
Right. Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, you could dump all your data in there and have it, produce data analytics. Hopefully, they're not doing that with your data.
I remember one of the when we talked about the cloud, right? It was always, "Hey, cloud's great. What's the security risk?" At the end of the day, it's your data on somebody else's computer. They have access to it just as much as you do. So, how secure is that going to be? That's always makes you kind of take a step back. So, real world examples. Chris, you'd mentioned that earlier, right? On some of the, and Mike, you too. Once when we talked before, what have you guys seen as real world examples of what not to do?
Mike, you go first because I'm taking up a lot of airtime.
Oh wow, what not to do, huh? Well, I'd say, spinning it the other way, you've got to patch your vulnerabilities. So when we're looking, well, or don't leave your systems vulnerable on the other side. So we see that when we're looking at third parties. We use actually we do use BitSight for some of our clients, and we do, it scans for vulnerabilities, list out vulnerabilities, so we can see whether they have good hygiene around patching or not. So and that's going to be, again, going back to the low hanging fruit. If there's a known vulnerability hanging out there for 6 years and it hasn't been patched, well, that's where anyone can go and get into the system.
I would add to that, right? If you look at like it's been a long week and my words are failing me at the moment. Oh, CIS, there we go. CIS, critical security controls. And if you look at any framework, let's be honest, if you look at NIST or whatever, the very first thing is know where your assets are, right? Have an asset inventory. I have yet to find an organization in the last 20 years, and I've been pounding the pavement trying to do that for a number of reasons. I've been speaking at conferences and asking people, and I talk to clients, and who has a good asset inventory? And very few people actually believe that they do. And so, you're right, Mike, you got to patch things, but if you don't know where they are, and a good example is back in the Heartbleed days, so I'm going back a little bit here. There was one hospital, or they were either a hospital or payer, I can't remember off the top of my head, but they were compromised through Heartbleed because somebody found a VPN gateway that had not been patched. However, according to them, right, you really don't get that much visibility in public disclosures, but according to them, they had patched like 8 different VPN gateways that they had, but they didn't say they didn't know that they had this one, but why would you patch 8 but not the 9th one or whatever it was, right? So the inference is, they just didn't have a great asset inventory. So you're right. You got to patch and you got to figure out what's important. And that's a weird metric because, you can say it's a critical vulnerability, but if it's super hard to exploit and the likelihood is not very high, then should you patch all critical vulnerabilities? It's the ALE model, right? It's vulnerability severity times likelihood divided
by threat.
Right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
yeah. But a lot of people they go patch the critical vulnerabilities. And if you talk to vulnerability teams, and I love vulnerability management teams, I'm not saying anything bad about them, but they get lost in this loop of see a vulnerability, remediate a vulnerability, rinse, repeat, right? And they try to prioritize it in the best way they know, but they don't necessarily understand the business consequences of it. And the likelihood of it being exploited is not a clear metric, right? You can use all the threat intel you want to see whether or not the threat actors are actually targeting it or you. But that's just signal. It's not definitive, right? And you don't necessarily know the business. Plus, the business might go, hey, we can recover from that. That's fine, right? Let that, it's not important to the business, even though it's critical vulnerability. And that's the third component that it's difficult.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. You have to know the importance of your assets.
So from that, then, would you say, as a things to keep in mind as a CISO, know what your assets are and have them tracked, identified. But on top of that, how's the business using them, right? Because that's tied to the functionality. They may use things that they shouldn't be using the way they're not supposed to be used, but it works. So, hey, they're going to use it. But if you don't know what that is, as a CISO, you're not sure if there's a better solution or if that one way they're using that one device is causing a lot more risk than they realize. Understanding the business impact of those assets is key. So assets, understanding the business use of those assets, and then the vulnerability piece. As you point out, so many vulnerability teams, let's just rinse and repeat. Where's the vulnerability? Okay, let's fix it. Or they might use MITRE to understand where stack rank everything and go it that way. But that may still not take into consideration how the business uses that. So you've got to be able to say, here's MITRE vulnerability, here's how my business is using the technology, and that intersection then produces a set of focused areas, if you will, that define what the CISO or the security team should focus on from a supply chain perspective, understanding their own issues, but then understanding, hey, what are you guys doing as my vendors? What are we doing to protect ourselves upstream and our providers? So I think those are some key points there.
Yeah, the level of is a good point, right? Because I think I was just to be clear, right? I think you made a good point, but I want to make sure it doesn't get lost. And I think I kind of lost it in my narrative is that yes, your own assets are super important, but then that level of abstraction when you're thinking about vendors' assets and how important are they to that vendor, and then how important are those assets to you, right? Do you know where your data is being stored? Is it which assets, right? And what's the dependencies within that vendor? Because, if there's this minor asset over here that gets compromised, then all of a sudden the business shuts down because it's doing some critical function that you're not aware of, even though your data is not resident on it. Then you need to know that. And that is it's a tremendously difficult job because of the abstraction.
Yep. Agreed. There's ways to navigate it, I think, to reduce the risk, but we're also talking security teams with lack of resource and lack of expertise. So that's where tools come in to place and expertise comes into place to be able to accelerate that as best as possible. So
Sure. And will the third party be open to sharing that information beyond where your data is stored in this system? Looks good. We've got all our controls in place. Never mind what's over here.
There's another level of abstraction, which for anybody who's run the third party risk program knows, is that you're not the one who's actually has the relationship with that third party anyway, right?
Absolutely.
So now, that level of abstraction is you to the business relationship manager with that third party. And so if you're the cyber if you're the cyber aspect of the third party risk program, then you got to go through the line of business relationship manager who needs to go through the relationship manager at the vendor who got to go talk to their cyber people. And where's the truth, right? That's the hard part.
By the time you find their IT person who's willing to talk to you, the incident will be resolved or the company will be out of business.
I used to have an employee who would call me as soon as things went wrong. And after a while, I would just let I would let it go to voicemail and I'd have a cup of coffee and then I'd call them back and they would have figured it out by then, right? So that's how this works too.
Makes it easy. That's fine. Reviewing vendor security protocols or having making sure your vendors' protocols are clear. I mean, obviously that's good. We mentioned NIST, CIS 18 for sure. There's a dozen others. So that's certainly a step in the process that needs to be considered. What vendor management strategies have you guys seen that work, or would you recommend that you see no one's working on, no one's doing, but they should?
That's a hardball, Jeff. You didn't prep me for that one.
I mean, I'll jump in and say I think for us, well, we're going through, we rely on kind of the old standards, which is questionnaires. We'll look at a SOC report or, maybe a ISO certification, insurance certification. But, to come down to it, like we said, those are items, they're artifacts. We have no real proof behind it, unless it's an audited, an audited certification. But what I find, and really going back to a scanning and rating tool, is that we do have some proof of how the third party is taking care of their uh, their assets that are internet connected. So we can actually see, I mean, if they're not taking care of that, they're not taking care of anything. So if they're doing a good job on the outside, hopefully you can extrapolate they're doing a good job on the inside, I think.
Yeah, it's funny. I did a talk not too long ago where I showed three houses and just from the outside, right? So, and can you guess what's going on inside? One of them was, if you guys or anybody listening is old enough, remembers Malcolm in the Middle. And that place was a disaster. And you're like, that place probably doesn't have, the flipper flop, new backsplash and updated bathroom, right? You're pretty sure of that. So to your point, Mike, it's like that. I think it's interesting. I've run, so at BitSite, we run third-party risk workshops for our customers and prospects. And I've been involved in, I would say, close to 60 at this point. So, and it's funny because I've seen everything from one organization only puts a contract in place. That's it. That's all they do. They put a lot of penalties in the contract, and then that's how they manage their vendors, which not recommending, by the way, but it works for them. To organizations that have that there's one organization that has 10 questions, but they insist on doing it interactively. They get like a 4-hour Zoom call now. It used to be on site, right? And they're very general questions on purpose because they listen for what the responses are and then they unravel that, right? So it's basically one question with 700 parts to it, right?
Right.
Sure.
What the answer is. I worked with a financial company and I actually created something that got filed into a patent by accident. I didn't realize it was, but good for me. Where basically, the company looks at their tier, which tier the vendor's in. So critical tier vendor, you're probably going to do all the things that you normally do: questionnaire, maybe some sort of remote audit, get the attestations, do a full assessment on them, right? But let's say they hit tier 2, tier 3, they basically look at the BitSite rating and certain risk vectors that are indicators. And it depends upon what kind of industry they're working with, right? Because some of the risk vectors are more important for different vendors. Like one of them's an IoT-based one, which would be more important for a manufacturing type of organization. They have good hygiene on that side of things. But then they might just go, hey, we're not even going to send a questionnaire. What we're going to do is we're going to ask you to send a recent audit report that's, no older than 6 months or whatever. We'll do a quick assessment of that. And as long as, everything from the data observation side of thing, using something like BitSite, and you've got a pretty clean bill of health from an audit, we're just going to onboard you. Then we'll monitor you, right? I mean, if you're going to use something like BitSite, just put them in continuous monitoring because if things change, and that's the problem with the old way, right? Do a questionnaire and then everybody has aspirations of reassessment once a year, but that only happens for some of the critical tiers, tier 2, tier 3 usually doesn't get reassessed unless something happens. But, what do they call that? The Monday problem? Something like, there's a term for it where that's on Monday, but by next Monday, something happened on Tuesday and you weren't aware of it till the next Monday. And the same thing happens with these periodic reassessments. You don't know what happens in the interim. So continuous monitoring is it's the name of the game. It's what people are talking about now.
To kind of, I wanted to hit on the same point. So to encapsulate what you're saying, obviously at one end, you've got, here, sign this contract and you're good to go. And then you've got the other end, we're going to talk to you every week and make sure your stuff's in order. And it's, one question with 700 parts, which is fine. In some industries, that's absolutely necessary. But in most cases, it's not. So if you can show your compliance, both to a particular standard that works for your organization and your vendors, but then you can show operationalization of that compliance standard, how you are doing it every day, and you can also your vulnerability program and or your changes in posture, right? Your monitoring, your ongoing response plan. Those things have to be tweaked and changed and monitored. So I've seen organizations do supply chain monitoring as its own separate program, and they're doing stuff every week, right? They're checking and double checking. But I also know firsthand, right? There's a very, very large telecommunications company that will be nameless that has 6,400 vendors, and they use an Excel spreadsheet. And they don't do self-attestation. They don't do, everybody can buy whatever they want and plug it in. And this is a really large telco, and that's how their current list is being managed, and that's unfortunate. But I mean, how small and medium businesses are kind of left to cloud's the cheapest, fastest way to go. So I'm going to put everything in the cloud. I'm not to all of the conversation we had earlier. I don't need to go build the server to run my business. I'm going to go buy it because it's preset. It's already made. I'm going to plug it in. I'm going to put a data center, connect to a data center, go use a bunch of SaaS applications, and off we go. Right. But the risk there is it's this. It's so untangible. People keep looking at the results of the great tools that we've got, but without taking into consideration, how do I continuously, to your point, how do I continuously monitor this situation and make sure my vendors are on point? I mean, those are some pretty interesting challenges, and can be, bang your head against the wall for a month too. So
There's the issue of outreach too, right? Like when you're talking to vendors and you find something that you want them to address, right? So you stick it into some sort of risk register or however you're managing it in Excel. Um, is so yeah, I think there's this burnout because the vendor sprawl has been quicker than we can keep up with it, right? We're not resourcing. And when I've talked to so many TPRM teams, and I have to say maybe 5% of them feel like they've got enough resources. And in fact, some of them will restrict the rigor of their assessments based upon how many resources and what their backlog is, which is not a good way to go, right? Because sometimes it's like TSA, right? If somebody's got a bomb in their shoe and you're just like, I got a whole line of people, just go, you don't know which one has the bomb in their shoe. So,
Yep.
But
agreed.
when you reach out to them, I'm finding that because of this sort of burnout, that a lot of them will push back and say, that's not a problem. And a good example is they might do something like an endpoint protection. I can't remember what Microsoft's SaaS services is, something Tune or something like that. Intune. That doesn't sound
Intune.
right.
Yeah.
Is it Intune? Okay. Yeah. And I was just talking to a customer who's pointing to that now, and where you get a certificate mismatch because of the way that Intune works and blah blah blah. But they just did what Microsoft said. Microsoft said just put a CNAME record, point to us, and we'll manage your systems. Right? We're good to go. But certificate mismatch, I mean, the whole point of TLS is it not only does it set up encryption, but it identifies the server so that you know that you're not being manned in the middle or whatever, right? So certificate mismatch breaks that whole mechanism. Now, don't get me wrong, there might be something else that's happening behind the scenes that I'm not aware of. But the point is that they're going, Microsoft told us to do this. That's what we did. We're safe. And I'm like, well, that's not the right answer. The right answer is when somebody tells you you have a potential problem, you should probably go look at it.
Definitely an area of responsibility. So, yep. So what, on emerging tech, when we talked about AI in the supply chain, is there anything that you guys have seen from an emerging technology perspective that's either going to increase the complexity of supply chain or decrease the complexity of supply chain? Because we all talk about AI, and that's great. And we mentioned earlier, and it can actually do well when you want to reduce the engagement, lower the risk, the conversation, the attestation, the compliance control sets, operationalization. You can do that with some AI tool sets for sure. But how would you, there's still no guarantee there. One, you're using, again, AI is, ChatGPT or Copilot or whatever you use, is the 3,000 or 4,000 new AI tool sets that exist. It's still your data on somebody else's computer. So
yeah, I mean, I think the state of the art right now for helping, because I think the sprawl is what it is at the moment, right? I don't know how it can get much worse, to be honest with you. And it's just new technology that complicates things, AI, and I think that's the new poster child for the time being. We thought mobile was going to kill everything. I remember having arguments with IBM. They were like, "This is going to, it's going to expose all kinds of data." I'm like, mobile devices are the owner's problem. It's not really the business problem. We solved that pretty quickly. So thankfully that went away. But I don't know what's else there, but I know that what I see as being a help for third-party risk teams, and I think there's two sides to it, right? You're the TPRM program with vendors, or you're the vendor who's getting out. You're being asked to fill out all these questionnaires. Is things like the Trust Hub, right? Where you can put your attestations and you can put a questionnaire that's probably based upon either ISO or NIST or SIG-Lite or something like that, right? You put those out there, and then when a vendor wants to do business with you, they go to the Trust Hub and they get all that stuff automatically. And it does two things. It helps them to decide who's the best vendor, right? If cybersecurity is is a competitive advantage, which hopefully it is. And it also gives them quick access to that, and it reduces the burnout on the vendors because if you get 20 questionnaires a year, that's fine. You're probably doing a pretty good job, and you could probably reuse some of the stuff that you had. But when you get 200, 2,000, it becomes insane. You eventually start to pencil whip them, not out of malice, but just. And a lot of them, like I'm seeing a lot of AI based questionnaires that just dig so deep. And I'm like, but that's not relevant to what we do, right? I'll answer the questions that are relevant to what BitSite does, for example, right? Or Access Point or whomever. But don't ask me these generalized questions that dig so deep. And so I think context is something that I'm seeing a lot where customers they're starting to mature third-party risk programs, I should say. They're starting to break down their questionnaires into logical pieces that are relevant to different industries that they do business with, and they only send what they need. And the second one is they're going through questionnaires and finding out questions that are redundant, right? You can ask it once and not have to ask it again, or ask it in the right way so that you get the incomplete answer. Because SIG-Lite still is like 180 questions, right?
Yeah.
So,
Oh yeah, yeah. And forget about the false egg. Yeah.
yeah. So send 20 questions and ask the right questions, or maybe 40 if they're a complicated vendor or something like that. So reduce the burden on the vendor. You're going to get better answers. It reduces the burden on you because you have to do less assessing, right? Because you do have to look through all that stuff. And then if you use things like trust hubs, then you're also reducing. So I think it's just about, I would say, reducing the amount of resources required to do this without increasing your risk is probably the goal. And that's what I'm saying right now.
Yeah, I think the Trust Hub is great, but there's multiple out there, right? Many vendors have their own. It's kind of like the old VCR and beta. I mean, it would be nice if we could have all the Trust Hubs communicating, but um, you know, Nirvana. But yeah, I mean, beyond that, I don't see anything else at the moment to make it any easier. I mean, it's really understanding. I mean, you can make it easier on yourself by understanding what the vendor does for you, and then, you know, doing it in context. I mean, and eliminating a lot of work for vendors that really don't pose any risk for you. I mean, I think that's really the bottom line. And if you're sending everyone out a SIG Lite, you're just wasting time. So
Yeah, exactly.
I will
So
I
go
will
ahead.
say, oh, sorry, Jeff,
No,
just
go ahead.
one last thought on that. I will say that after talking to how many third-party risk management teams at different organizations, I would say that probably 50%, and I'm probably being generous, are still in the crawl stage, right? A lot of them are revisiting legacy third-party risk programs or just building new ones because they never realized they needed them. So I think the reason why we're not seeing a lot more innovative ways to go about this is that organizations are just starting to really think this through at a more business level. So once they catch up, then I think more innovation, or they'll come up with ideas that they need to use or something.
So, what would be two recommendations from each of you on what you would recommend if you were sitting across the table from a CISO, a CIO, a CEO, and they're saying, "Hey, look, we do some third-party risk management, but it's not as mature as we'd like it to be. What should we do? How do we make it better?" Right. So, we're a level 2 from a CMM perspective. We want to get to a 4. What should we do? What comes to mind to you guys?
I'll throw one out, and then you can throw one out, Mike. We'll do it that way. That way, you get a little bit of time to think. Because one that occurred to me is involve everybody who has a stake in this, right? You've got to get legal, you've got to get procurement, you've got to get business relationship managers within the business units together, you've got to get cybersecurity, you got to get security ops because they're going to do continuous monitoring. Get everybody on board. If you don't have the team, if you don't have a policy and a process, and you have a framework that's all part of the foundation of your third-party risk management program, you're just going to be yelling into the canyon, right? It's not going to fire on all cylinders, and people are not going to be, they're not going to follow through, and it's just going to be a hodgepodge. It's going to be a patchwork of what you think risk is. So that'd be my first thing.
yeah, and I would say, and I mean, it's kind of redundant what I said before, but understanding what the vendor does, and then as a follow on, as a second, really, once, even while they're going through the assessment process, and then once they're on board, it just continually monitoring their posture. I mean, that's really what's going to, I think, give you the best evidence if they're doing what they say they're doing.
So definitely that the continuous monitoring piece, but also forcing everyone to understand what your assets are, like we talked earlier, to be able to do that well.
I would say my second one then is know what your data flow looks like, right? And you don't necessarily have to do that at the vendor, because you can see where your data is going to, like who's accessing which systems, what data is resident where, et cetera. And this is not a plug, but I have a friend who just sold his company, as a matter of fact, it was called Noetic, and they did that. They basically I think they had sensors which sort of looked and it told you where your data flow was. And I mean, if you think about, for example, CASB products, they kind of do that, but they're looking at a very specific function. But if you can look at it from a larger perspective, then that gives you some situational awareness that you might not have. And you might know where your data is going, you know who's accessing which systems, and and that can also sort of give you this extrapolated asset inventory as well.
Well, guys, I appreciate it. We spent a good bit of time here today really hashing out a few things, coming up with some ideas and recommendations. Really appreciate the time. Hopefully our audience will gain some good, solid direction out of this. I really appreciate it. Thank you, audience. Tune in next time. We'll be discussing another varied topic on the state of security. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Thanks.
Yep.
Thanks, Jeff. Mike.
Thanks.
Pleasure.